Hello and welcome to The Last Sip this week, where we continue to be out of studio on the road talking to people of color who are leading important social change organizations at this pivotal moment in social change history in the United States. And this week we are in New York at the offices of Amnesty International to talk to the executive director of Amnesty International USA, Margaret Huang. So Margaret, thank you for taking the time to join us.
It's a pleasure.
And as I should say, we have known each other since high school.
Yes, we have.
We started out knowing
Just
each other
a few years
just
ago.
a few years ago. Doing Model UN here in New York, just a few blocks from here.
At the United Nations.
United Nations.
Yeah.
So there is hope out there for all you Model UN geeks or geeks overall. You too can be sitting and leading human rights organization. So, I don't know.
Stay with it.
Yeah, keep reading UN briefing books late at night. It'll pay off. So again, thank you for taking the time. You're normally in Washington, which is where Amnesty International USA is. And the USA part is important because you have over 80 different Amnesty Internationals around the world. And USA is a part of Amnesty International and is a part of the conversation on human rights. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you is because in so many ways it appears, and also in reality, we have a range of human rights challenges in the United States. But often Americans don't like to think of human rights as something that is a question here. Human rights is something that happens elsewhere in the world, happens abroad in the world. And even during the civil rights movement, when it was even clearer of the legal barriers to full human rights that we had in the United States, the Kennedy administration would talk about human rights in the context of the Cold War as something that happened elsewhere and happened in places that had a, quote, lack of freedom and were under Soviet totalitarianism, when many of the shades of those same things were here in the United States. So I'm curious as to this relationship between the idea of human rights in the United States and the rest of the world and how you see that now.
So when human rights really took off after the United Nations was formed at the end of the 1940s, it was very much conceived of as part of the United States foreign policy portfolio. So when President Jimmy Carter came in and said he really wanted to make human rights a priority of his administration, that happened in the State Department. It did not happen at the Department of Justice. And it's been very interesting over the last couple of decades as I've done human rights work in the United States. It's been a completely different conversation with officials in government. I would talk to the State Department folks who would tell me, well, we don't work on the United States. And I'd go to the Department of Justice folks and they'd say, well, we don't do human rights, we do civil rights. And you always felt a little bit as if the government didn't know how to respond when you raised concerns about human rights here in the US.
There are a full range of human rights concerns that are in the United States. Topics that you would focus on around the world are focused in the United States: mass incarceration, police violence, the rights of women, the rights of LGBTQ people, the rights of migrants and immigrants. These are all headlines that you would read around the world and that would be cited on the Senate floor, right, as a cause in X country. But those are all right now acute in the United States as issues.
Yeah, absolutely. When Amnesty International USA was created 50 plus years ago, we actually had a very external focus. So the members of Amnesty came to the organization because they cared a lot about human rights in other parts of the world. And then it's been over the last decade or more that we've actually seen our members starting to recognize the human rights violations here in the US. A lot of people have started talking about the right to water, for example, in the aftermath of what happened in Flint, Michigan. That's something Amnesty has done research on and documented that as a human rights crisis in other countries. We haven't done it yet in the United States, and I'm really hoping we're going to get there.
I remember seeing you in Ferguson, seeing other Amnesty people in Ferguson, and that's when I thought, there's something different that's not only happening in this organization, but there's something different that's happening in the United States.
Absolutely. So Amnesty International has observed elections, has observed protests, has observed the kinds of interactions between activists and police all over the world. We had never done that in the United States before. and after Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson, and we saw the aftermath, which was very much about an over response by police to protesters, to journalists trying to cover the story, we felt it was really important for Amnesty to take the position that we needed to monitor that situation as well. So for the first time in the US, we actually sent international human rights observers to Ferguson. And we've done it a few times since. We also went to Baltimore when the protests broke out around Freddie Gray. We sent observers to the two political conventions in 2016 because we were actually quite concerned that there would be aggravated protests, particularly in Ohio, where they have a right to carry arms openly.
Can you talk about racial justice as a human rights issue, right?
Actually, it's fundamental. One of the very first human rights treaties that was ever adopted after the Universal Declaration took effect was actually the treaty to prevent all forms of racial discrimination. And it's because governments around the world recognized that, in fact, no country was doing the right thing by racial minorities or racial groups within various countries.
I'm wondering the degree to which sort of your own experience as someone who grew up in this country, not in the majority, in the South, right? Yeah. How that experience is something that you brought to your job and the way in which you think it makes you different than someone else who would have held it.
I grew up in East Tennessee in a very small town. I was one of very few Asians or African Americans or Latinos in my school. And I absolutely had the experience of othering growing up. So the ability to identify how people get othered and how to challenge that as part of our human rights work is key to our being able to be successful. And I think for many people of color, that's why we come to this work.
It's one of the things that happens that allows certain people to say certain people don't deserve human rights.
Absolutely.
Right? That's where the division comes in.
Yeah.
You're different, so you don't deserve this.
Yeah, and we've seen it across history. People have talked about who deserves it, who's good enough to have it, who has a historical claim to it, and all of that contributes to the sense that many people have where they're questioning whether or not, am I entitled to the same rights as everyone else? And the answer is always yes.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to us. Your time is limited. There's so many problems that you have to spend your time on. But thank you for taking the time to sit down. It was really wonderful.
Great conversation.
And just congratulations to you and everything that you're doing at Amnesty and that Amnesty is continuing to do in the United States and around the world to support human rights.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. And that concludes this conversation. On to the next one.